What can journalism teach us as materials writers? I've dabbled in journalism a few years ago, and I really find that some of the tips and techniques help me a lot when I'm, for example, writing reading texts or creating audio or even doing video interviews. In this video, I talked to Ian McMaster. Ian will tell you about himself, but he has a great background in journalism and ELT, so I hope it's helpful. Okay, Ian, can you begin by introducing yourself and telling us about your background in journalism and ELT teaching and sort of how the two things connected in your life?
Yeah, sure, John. Well, I'm from England originally, and there I had a background in economics and freelance journalism and working as a press officer. I came to Germany at the end of the 80s, and then I did my teaching qualification. I did a lot of teaching English and typically business English here in Munich, where I'm based, and spent 3 or 4 years doing that full time before getting a job as an editor at Spotlight magazine. Spotlight is a magazine, a general English magazine in Germany, to help German speakers improve their English. And it really was a mixture of journalism with articles, but also language teaching through various types of language help, including exercises. And I later went on, and for the last 20 years, I was editor-in-chief of Business Spotlight, which was a magazine for people needing English at work. And again, that mixture of journalism and English language teaching. And I stopped full-time work a year or so ago. But really, those jobs at Spotlight and then Business Spotlight brought together for me, they brought together journalism, the journalism side of my experience, the English language ELT side, and also my interest in business and the world of work. So that's how the things come together, and that was for me a sort of perfect storm, if you like.
Okay, I mean, I think one interesting thing is I have a very limited journalism background, but I can see the connection in terms of when I write like a reading text for a reading lesson, I want an article or maybe a listening, or I'm going to interview somebody for video. There's this sort of idea of getting a good story. And I guess in your work even though you were producing a magazine on English that was sort of good for the learners, it was another way to learn English, you still had to make sure that the news stories in the magazine made the students want to keep buying it, because it had, presumably, as well as teaching them English, you wanted them to learn something about business at the same time. So you had to set about getting a good story, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the biggest compliment we got was that people said they enjoyed reading the magazines, and we had other products as well, like audio, but the magazines, even if they weren't learning English. So in other words, the text had to be interesting enough to stand up on their own. And we were working with we were working kind of 2-3 months ahead of publication each time. But I used to say we could follow the 3 R's. Now, traditionally, the 3 R's, in Britain, we used to say reading, writing, and arithmetic, maths. And I sort of adapted those 3 R's and said our topics had to be they had to be relevant to the people that were reading them. They had to be right. They had to be correct, sort of linguistically and everything. But they also had to be at the right time. So they couldn't be topics that were going to be terribly out of date. If people are not interested in your topics, if they wouldn't be interested in it if they're not learning a language, why should they be interested in it when they're learning a language? So that is.
I think that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, and it's nice, this idea of you're writing something for language learners, but they're also learning something new. I mean, I remember picking up Business Spotlight, and I would just start reading it because it had interesting topics in it, and it didn't matter about the language level. I was learning something new about business. Yeah. And I think it's quite nice if you've written a course book and you meet a teacher who says, well, I just like reading the articles in it anyway, because it's got interesting topics. And then I think you've got it right as a materials writer, or if you like, as a journalist, because you've gone beyond just reading it because it's good for you to learn English. You're reading it because there's an intrinsic reason to read the article. Yeah. You've given us sort of your 3 R's in terms of sourcing the story. Are there any other tips you could give materials writers in terms of sourcing content, perhaps in terms of you might go researching for the content, or you might even kind of interview somebody for the content. Yeah. So presumably asking questions would be important.
Yeah, maybe if I just go one step back into some other journalistic principles, it's sometimes said that, the basic questions of any journalistic article that you want to answer in a text, and I would think this would be relevant also for a text written for learning purposes, is who, what, when, and how. In other words, who was involved, what happened, when did it happen, how. Journalists often also write text so that, news particularly, that the important stuff's at the top of the article, because if an article is going to be shortened, it should be shortened from the bottom. You should be able to cut away the last few paragraphs and the story still stands. And the other question, when that might happen in ELT, you might have to shorten the text. So actually, it'd be quite nice if you could just chop off the last paragraph, unless, of course, that's where the reveal is. But the other question is, so what, or who cares? So that again comes back to relevance. Obviously, depending on where you're publishing, there might be limits or restrictions on what topics you can actually cover. But if you have that it's your focus. Would I want to read this? Can I expect other people to be interested in this? And obviously it's not then your particular hobby horse too much. You've got to have a bit of a feel for what people generally might be interested at this moment. With course books, that can be a problem if they're on the market too long. But yes, the part of the journalists, one of the key skills for journalists obviously is asking people questions to get information from them. So that could be as a source you might be talking to somebody as a source for a piece you're writing, but you might also be interviewing somebody for audio material.
So are there any sort of like interview techniques you might use to get someone to sort of, I don't know, do you have to get them feeling relaxed at the beginning, or what kind of techniques would you have for that?
Yeah, well, in this context, you're not doing a kind of a hard-nosed journalistic interview. So what you wouldn't do is come in with that typical sort of TV journalist question where you try to trick somebody with the very first one, by saying, so why did you make such a mess of this policy or something? You want to, as you say, warm people up, particularly if they're not speaking English maybe as their first language, and depending on how confident they are. A good rule is that most people like talking about themselves.
Yes.
So there are exceptions and there are cases where that goes to excess, but so usually if you can throw somebody a question that gives them the opportunity to talk about what they've done or what they think or what they're planning to do, depending on what the focus of your interview is, that helps with a lot of people. Another way is with some people is to relax them at the beginning by maybe talking a little bit yourself, actually, just to give them the chance to listen to start with, to tune their ear into English if they're not speaking it the whole time. So interestingly, a key part of listening skills is actually being able to ask people questions. And you have sometimes when you're just in a conversation with somebody, if you ask questions the whole time, it can sound like an interrogation. So you have to take the pressure off people and maybe give them a breather, and you say something just about yourself that you're not going to use possibly for the actual material, but it's just a way of giving them a chance to relax and not feel they're on the spot the whole time.
Yeah, I had a colleague who was a journalist. I think she worked for Newsweek, and she used to say it's not so much asking questions. The best interviews are where they just turn into a general conversation and you provoke responses merely by chatting rather than questioning almost. And she said often you get the more interesting kind of content from the person when you can develop the kind of the interview in that way.
Well, absolutely. And that goes back again to another key listening skill, which is that you're actually focusing on what the other person is saying, because if you go in there with your list of 10 questions you're going to ask, regardless of how it goes, you might miss the most interesting point, which is actually, responding to what somebody says, and the conversation goes in maybe a different direction to what you'd planned, and you end up throwing away half the questions that you'd prepared, which are there partly to structure the interview in a sense, like we're doing here, but they're also as a kind of safety net to kind of get things going, and as you say, reacting to what's being said, and leaving the script to one side maybe. But you need the confidence to do that, which requires practice, I guess.
Yeah. Another thing for materials writing is sort of sourcing information and so on. It's funny, I was watching the film She Said last night about the Harvey Weinstein case, and it was two journalists. And throughout the film, I was struck by the amount of emphasis on fact checking, and they were checking their sources and checking secondary sources. I mean, is that something you had to deal with in the magazine? Were you super concerned about fact checking all the time, and where you were getting the information from?
Yeah, we were. We had people who had the part of their role, dedicated role, was as the fact checker. And I do think that materials writers, and ELT writers generally, we can learn from that, because, well, one example that often comes up is, for example, somebody will send in an article and there'll be a quote from somebody at the beginning of the article or somewhere, and you can almost guarantee that this quote will be, attributed to Mark Twain or George Bernard Shaw, or
I always find that Einstein has a quote for everything virtually. I mean,
Einstein.
He seemed to comment on every single topic, and somebody could always find an Einstein quote. And I can't believe that he spent his time producing that many quotes. But anyway, sorry I interrupted.
Well, no, exactly. That's exactly it. I mean, I was doing a talk recently for the teachers in Berlin, and I wanted to use the quote along the lines of, the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know. There are different variations of this quote. Now, if you actually look on the internet and try to source it, you do find anybody from Einstein to Tony Bennett, the singer, and you just think this is so. Some of these quotes, it's actually quite hard to pin down whether anybody actually said it, but a lot of them you actually can, with a little bit of research. So that's one example. Rather than just throwing it out and saying this was Oscar Wilde, or the first one you come across on the internet. But also, is it has the quote been quoted, or this accurately? Often it's not quite what we have in mind. Now, that might seem to be over sort of fussy maybe, but it's kind of an example of at least something to think about when you're claiming something or quoting something. A little bit of fact checking doesn't do any harm.
Well, it's also in these days, I mean, 20 years ago when I first started writing, I mean, you did make up characters in text. And if you look at ELT publishing and course books, there was a lot more sort of fictional stuff. If you look at the early Headway books or whatever, I'm sure a lot of those texts and characters were made up. And of course, now if you've got something in a course book, students can Google it straight away to check if that person exists, or if that place exists, or if an event actually happened, down to when it happened, the date and everything. So the whole fact checking thing has become more important than ever. And I see editors, when you're writing course materials, editors constantly checking, where did this come from? Is this correct? I found it in another place and it was a different date. So that sort of, you can see that kind of fact checking's really kind of increased now.
Maybe it's an argument for going back full circle and going back to made up things where
it is nicer when you get the freedom to make it up. Or maybe people these days can just go to ChatGPT and get it to make it up. I don't know, but yeah. So we've looked at getting a good story, asking the right questions, sort of sourcing information, fact checking. There are other journalistic skills that you think material writers could benefit from developing?
I think one of the key ones is actually to go for simplicity rather than complexity. I mean, a general tendency that a lot of people have when they start off, and I include myself obviously in this, and something they still do from time to time, is writing in a manner that is too complex. It's almost like we're trying to show that we're good writers rather than and to be honest, very few of us are, really good writers in that sense, but that we have a style that can be complex and yet at the same time really good. I'm certainly not. I always aim to write as simply as possible. And I think that is something that a good skill is if you write something, let's say it's just for the sake of argument 200 words long. It doesn't really matter what the length is, but then basically to look at it again, maybe after, have a break, look at it again and say, okay, I'm going to cut 20% of this out. So it's going to now be, what would it be, 160 words and not 200 words. But my criteria are going to be, I'm not going to lose any of the content, the real content, and I'm not going to completely ruin the style. And you will find that actually this is really very easy to do. Normally it's very easy, and sometimes when there are space constraints, for example, say in a magazine, obviously in the internet there's less constraint, but I mean on the magazine you have very tight constraints. And I always found that if we sent a text to layout and it came back and it needed 10 lines cutting, let's say, from the text was usually better afterwards than it was before, in the sense we should have cut those 10 lines out beforehand, or we could have. So, simpler words, not complicated words. There are some, there's some nice rules by George Orwell. They really are from George Orwell. George Orwell's tips on good writing, about, not using complicated words where simple ones would do. Funnily enough, I did ask ChatGPT for some rules of good writing recently. We've all done this recently, I think, haven't we? And it came out with things like, quite sensible things like know your audience, have a clear purpose, use appropriate language, use an active voice, be concise, edit and proofread. I mean, it's kind of not wildly exciting, but it kind of, it's sensible stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, I remember reading that there's the book by George Orwell, isn't there? I can't remember. Is it On Writing or something, where he has his tips, and one of his main one is avoid the passive form, always use the active. And of course, you get these rules, and then as you start writing for higher levels of learners, you need to kind of get the passive in there, and then you start looking around for what kind of text types have, defining relative clauses or passives, and you end up being forced to sort of almost break the rules of very direct, clear writing simply to model certain language. But you're right, if you can get it down shorter and clearer, then it's not just a question of level, it makes the writing better. And you're also presenting better models for your students, aren't you?
Yeah, you are. George Orwell did say, it was from an article called Politics and the English Language from 1946, and his sixth rule, or his fourth one, I've got it here, was never use the passive where you can use the active. But his last one was break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. So, he was actually smart enough to know that the passive is actually a very useful construction. And if you try to avoid it, and it was a little bit like that at Spotlight, where we would have articles at different language levels, and I used to sort of try to say, okay, I'm going to write one at our easiest level, which means, here are all these words I'm not allowed to use. And even if I wrote one at a higher level, I try to say I'm not going to have any words in the first 4 paragraphs that we're going to have to explain. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, because it made it very easy to read, but the whole point, we were supposed to introduce, like you said, other forms and more difficult vocabulary. So it's a bit of balancing act, let's put it that way.
Yeah, certainly. And also when you want topics that are engaging and interesting, sometimes you need language which is above level and wouldn't necessarily normally be taught. I wrote an article on biomimetics once, which is sort of design features of looking at nature to steal design to apply it to technology and stuff. And in that, it's a kind of an interesting text, but you just got to deal with language which is off the scale at times. But if you want an engaging text or about something new, then you kind of need to go down that sort of specialist route.
Just one tip there, because that's interesting what you say, because if you have let's say a text that's about a specialist topic, like you said, a scientific one, or it came off quite often when we had legal texts about legal issues, then that it will, by the nature of the text, have a lot of vocabulary which is quite difficult and specialized. But then what you can do is think, okay, but in the rest of the text where I don't need difficult language, I can keep it as simple as possible. So I'm not overloading people both with the specialist language and in the parts which are not about specialists, I'm not overloading it there. So, so they're not having to sort of do a double thing, if that's appropriate, again.
So in the magazine, did you used to make use of glossaries where you had vocabulary that was way above level?
We had a system that in our magazines and all the other magazines at the Spotlight Publishing House, which now is part of the Die Zeit publishing group in Germany, where we would grade the texts according to 3 levels, and there were glossaries were provided of vocabulary that was regarded as being, beyond that level, if you like. Or no, some people didn't like. Learners loved it. Teachers were often quite skeptical of the value of this. I grew to love it as it went along, I must admit, and thought, okay, if I read an article in French and the word was marked with there was a translation somewhere, and I knew it, I just didn't look, and if I didn't know it, I was quite glad that the translation was there, and I didn't have to spend too long trying to work it out from context and all these things that we as teachers ask people to do. But I mean, there are arguments for and against that method, but what it did as a writer, it kind of disciplined you, because you knew that, if you wrote in a way that was too complicated, then the article was going to be, almost every second word was going to be glossed. So that sort of disciplined your writing in a way. And therefore, if I was writing a text that had a legal or say a very economic background, I'd make sure that as far as possible, 90% of the words that were glossed were the specialist ones in that area, and not the more general language. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you're doing if you're writing an exercise, again, if you're that thing, you're testing certain vocabulary, you don't want people bogged down the fact they don't understand the task you're giving them, or getting bogged down in maybe other vocabulary which is not your target vocabulary for that exercise or whatever.
Yeah. I always associate tight deadlines with journalism and stuff. Is that something that is relevant to materials writers?
Yeah, I mean, there are different type of deadlines, aren't there? Like motivation, there's external deadlines and internal deadlines. So if you're working for let's say a publisher of some sort, whether print, online, whatever it is, then you are the publisher's nightmare if you don't deliver to deadline, and you're the publisher's darling if you do. When I started at Spotlight, my predecessor, who was an Australian journalist, said to me, he said, I'm only going to give you 2 tips here. And the first tip was no deadline, no work. And we're all a bit like that, so if you don't have an external deadline, how are you going to impose on yourself an internal deadline from, by whatever method you need to trick yourself psychologically to stick to the routine? But yeah, obviously there's the 2 worst things you can do as a journalist is miss the deadline and spell somebody's name wrong is the other one.
Okay.
That's the other.
I think both of those are relevant, particularly for materials writers. I remember on rare occasions, somebody will say to me, when can you deliver this by? And I will always say, just give me a date when you want it by, because I just have to have the date. And if you give me the date, that just completely drives me to get it done. If you leave it open, then it's not great. But
not priority.
But you're also right as materials writers. If you don't deliver to the deadline, then it's a problem. And in terms of, not everybody has editors. Like you can write something for a course book and it's going to get edited, and obviously in your context it is. But in terms of self-editing, any tips there?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that you can do on your own. Some of them are obvious, like just leaving the text for a day and coming back and looking at it with fresh eyes. This can have 2 effects. One is that you actually realize it wasn't as bad as you maybe thought while you were writing. It can be quite positive. It can also, you'll spot things with fresh eyes that you don't see while you're in the middle of writing. A lot of people can be good editors, but not necessarily good editors of their own writing. But say take a break. The tip I always gave people at Spotlight, or when writing the text, was to read them out loud. And when I say read them out loud, I really mean out loud. I don't mean sort of wandering around the flat reading it under your breath. I mean literally out loud, so that you're really hearing how it sounds. What this does, it will alert you to, well, alert you to mistakes. If it'll alert you to, you know, the rhythm of the text. It will alert you to things like repetition. Repetition's not always bad, but is it clumsy repetition or is it good repetition? You know, are you starting sentences always in the same way? Have they all got the same structure? This sort of thing. So reading out loud is great. And then just extending from, you know, being completely alone, giving it to somebody else, to whoever they are, you know, friend, partner, maybe a learner if you've got them, and asking them to read it. Is it clear to them in the way that you thought it was clear? Or, you know, and the step above that is asking somebody else to edit, not necessarily a professional editor, but just asking somebody to, you know, say, here we are, it's 100 words long. Can you take 10 words out?
Yeah, you always come back to that sort of it's half piloting something, particularly if you write sort of an audio script or something, unless you hear it out loud and ideally somebody else reading it, because it's quite hard to judge it sometimes. Yeah. And I've been in that situation where you maybe write an audio script, you end up in the recording studio, and then for the first time you hear the actors actually read it, and you kind of go, "Oh,
yeah, I know."
and you're sort of rewriting on the spot and stuff. But I mean, and similarly with readings, I think that's great advice. Yeah. Okay, thanks to Ian for that great interview. Just to sum up, some of the key tips I think that came out of it were, get a good story. So write something, for example, in a reading text that you'd actually want to read about, maybe in your own language, something where you learn something new, as well as writing a text simply to learn English. If you're interviewing somebody or trying to get information, think about the right questions: who, what, how. I also like Ian tips on who cares. So at the end of, you've written something, and then actually who's going to care about it? So is it relevant to your reader? Is it something that's stimulating? Fact checking, sourcing materials, learning to write to tight deadlines, good tips for materials writers, checking your writing, reading things out loud to see how they sound. They're all useful little tips there.